The wagon train disappeared into the dust, while Grace Donovan lay shivering against the trunk of a gnarled mesquite tree, her fever-bright eyes watching the last canvas cover fade into the Arizona horizon. She had been sick for 3 days, slowing the entire company down as they pushed toward California. This morning, when she could not stand without collapsing, the wagon master had made his decision. Her Uncle Thomas had protested, but not hard enough. They left her a canteen of water, a blanket, and promises to send help from the next settlement that rang hollow even as the words left their mouths. Grace knew the truth. She was 22 years old, and she was going to die alone on the desert floor somewhere between Casa Grande and the Colorado River. The September sun blazed overhead, turning the Arizona territory into a furnace. Grace pulled the thin blanket over her head, trying to shield herself from the relentless heat. Her whole body ached with the fever, muscles trembling uncontrollably. She had no idea what sickness had taken hold of her, only that it had struck suddenly and viciously. The water in the canteen sloshed when she moved, and she knew she should ration it, but her throat felt like sandpaper. She must have dozed, because when she opened her eyes again, the sun had moved considerably across the sky. Through her fevered haze, she heard something. The steady clip-clop of horse hooves on hard, packed earth. Grace tried to sit up, tried to call out, but her voice emerged as barely a whisper. The sound grew closer, then stopped. Well, I'll be damned. The voice was male, deep and rough like gravel, but not unkind. Grace forced her eyes open wider. A man crouched beside her, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. He wore dusty trail clothes, a faded blue shirt and worn leather vest. A revolver hung at his hip, but his hands were empty as he reached toward her. "Easy now," he said softly. "I'm not going to hurt you. My name's Ethan Mercer. Looks like somebody left you in a bad way." Grace tried to speak, but only managed a weak cough. Ethan's jaw tightened as he took in the single canteen, the inadequate blanket, the clear signs of abandonment. Sons of, he bit off the curse, then shook his head. "Don't matter who did this. What matters is getting you somewhere safe. Can you tell me your name, Grace?" she managed, the word barely audible. "Grace Donovan." "All right, Grace Donovan, I'm going to get you on my horse. It's going to hurt, but we need to move before the sun gets any worse. There's a ranch about 8 miles from here. Friend of mine runs it. We'll get you there, get this fever down. I promise you, I'll never leave you behind like those cowards did." He said it with such conviction that even through her delirium, Grace believed him. She had no choice anyway. Ethan was her only chance at survival. He was gentle as he lifted her, but Grace still gasped at the movement. Her head spun violently, and she would have fallen if Ethan hadn't had a firm grip on her. His horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding, stood patiently as Ethan maneuvered Grace into the saddle, then swung up behind her. He wrapped one arm securely around her waist, holding her against his chest. "Just hold on," he murmured near her ear. "We'll be there before you know it." Grace had no memory of the ride. She drifted in and out of consciousness, aware only of the steady rhythm of the horse's gait, the solid warmth of Ethan's body supporting her, and his voice occasionally speaking low and reassuring when she stirred restlessly. The next time she truly woke, she was lying on something soft. A real bed. The room was dim, curtains drawn against the sunlight, and she heard voices speaking in hushed tones nearby. "How long has she been like this?" A woman's voice, concerned. "Found her about 2 hours ago. Wagon train left her to die." Ethan's voice carried an edge of anger. "Fever's burning her up. I can see that. Help me get some cool water on her. We need to bring that temperature down before it cooks her brain." Grace felt cool cloths being placed on her forehead, her neck, her wrists. The blessed relief made her sigh. Hands lifted her head and a cup pressed to her lips. "Drink, dear, just small sips." The woman's voice was kind. Grace managed to swallow some water, then some more. It helped clear the fog in her mind a little. "That's good," the woman encouraged. "I'm Vera and you're at the Double M Ranch. You're safe here." Over the next few days, Grace existed in a twilight world of fever dreams and brief moments of clarity. She learned that Vera was Ethan's friend Marcus's wife, that the Double M stood for Marcus Miller, and that Ethan had been on his way back from delivering horses to the cavalry when he found her. During her lucid moments, Vera would spoon broth into her mouth and tell her about the ranch, about the harsh beauty of the Arizona territory, about anything to keep her focused on something other than the sickness ravaging her body. But it was Ethan's presence that Grace became most aware of. He checked on her frequently, often sitting in the chair beside her bed during the worst of her fever spells. Sometimes she would wake to find him there, his hat on his knee, reading from a worn book by lamplight. When she stirred, he would look up, and his face would soften with relief. "Welcome back," he would say, and those simple words became an anchor for her. On the 5th day, Grace's fever finally broke. She woke feeling wrung out and weak, but her head was clear for the first time in over a week. Morning light filtered through the curtains, and she could hear birds singing outside. She was alone in the room, which gave her a chance to take proper stock of her surroundings. It was a simple but comfortable bedroom, with whitewashed walls and sturdy furniture. A pitcher of water and a clean glass sat on the bedside table. Her own clothes, clean and mended, hung over a chair. She had no idea what she was wearing, but assumed Vera had dressed her in a nightgown. The door opened quietly, and Vera peeked in. When she saw Grace's clear eyes, her face lit up. "Oh, thank the Lord, you're awake and lucid." She hurried in, pressing a cool hand to Grace's forehead. "And the fever's gone. How do you feel?" "Weak as a kitten," Grace admitted, her voice still raspy, "but better. Thank you for taking care of me." "Nonsense. We couldn't very well let you die, could we?" Vera smiled warmly. She was a pleasant-looking woman of about 40 with kind eyes and capable hands. "Are you hungry? I've got fresh bread and some good beef broth." Grace's stomach rumbled in response, and Vera laughed. "I'll take that as a yes. You just rest, and I'll be back shortly." She returned with a tray laden with food, and though Grace couldn't eat much, what she managed tasted like heaven. Vera sat with her, filling her in on what had happened while she was sick. "Ethan rode out to try and catch up with your wagon train, let them know you were alive and recovering," Vera said. "But they had too much of a head start. He came back madder than a wet hen, said some things about your uncle that I won't repeat in polite company." Grace's throat tightened. She had known her uncle's care for her was lukewarm at best. After her parents died of cholera 2 years ago, Uncle Thomas had taken her in out of obligation, not love. When the opportunity came to join a wagon train headed for California, he had grudgingly paid her way but made it clear she was a burden. Being abandoned should not have surprised her, but it still hurt. "I have no one now," Grace said quietly. "No family, no resources. I don't know what I'm going to do." Vera patted her hand. "First, you're going to focus on getting your strength back. The rest we'll figure out in time. You're welcome to stay here as long as you need. We can always use an extra pair of hands on a ranch." Over the next week, Grace slowly regained her strength. She graduated from bed to a chair by the window, then to short walks around the house. The Double M Ranch was a sprawling operation with a main house, bunkhouse, barn, and extensive corrals. Marcus Miller ran cattle and horses and employed half a dozen ranch hands. It was a prosperous spread, and Vera ran the household with cheerful efficiency. Ethan was around frequently. Grace learned he owned a smaller spread about 20 miles west, where he raised horses primarily. He was 26 years old, had been in Arizona for 5 years, and was considered one of the best horse trainers in the territory. He was also, Grace could not help but notice, remarkably handsome. She tried not to think about that. Tried not to notice the way his dark hair curled slightly at his collar, or how his brown eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. Tried not to remember how safe she had felt in his arms during that desperate ride to the ranch. But it was hard not to notice, especially as she grew stronger and he began to spend more time talking with her. He would sit on the porch with her in the evenings, telling her stories about the territory, about breaking horses, about the characters he had met in his travels. Grace found herself laughing for the first time in months, and she treasured those conversations. "You saved my life," she told him one evening as they watched the sun set over the distant mountains. "I never properly thanked you for that." Ethan shook his head. "No thanks needed. Any decent person would have done the same. But you did it. You stopped, you helped, and you kept your promise. You didn't leave me behind." He looked at her then, his gaze intense. "I meant that, Grace. I'm not the kind of man who makes promises lightly." Something in his tone made her heart skip, but she pushed the feeling aside. She could not afford to develop feelings for Ethan Mercer. She had nothing to offer him except a worn-out dress and a questionable future. Besides, he was just being kind. She was a charity case, nothing more. But as September turned to October, and Grace grew strong enough to help Vera with household tasks, she found it increasingly difficult to ignore the growing attraction between them. Ethan found excuses to visit the Double M more frequently. He taught Grace to ride properly, patient and encouraging as she learned to handle one of his gentler mares. He brought her little gifts, a ribbon from town, a book he thought she might enjoy, wildflowers picked from the desert. "He's courting you," Vera said one afternoon as they worked together making preserves. "You know that, right?" Grace felt her cheeks heat. "He's just being kind." "Honey, I've known Ethan Mercer for 3 years. He's a good man, but he's not the type to waste time on someone he doesn't care about. He rides 40 miles round trip to see you nearly every other day. That's not kindness. That's interest." "I have nothing," Grace protested. "No money, no family, no prospects. What could I possibly offer someone like him?" Vera stopped stirring the pot and looked at Grace seriously. "You're smart, hardworking, and kind. You've got a good sense of humor and more courage than most people I've met. You survived being abandoned in the desert, for heaven's sake. I'd say you have plenty to offer." Grace wanted to believe her, but years of her uncle's dismissive attitude had left scars. She was used to being seen as a burden, an obligation, something to be tolerated rather than valued. That evening, Ethan asked if she would take a walk with him after dinner. They strolled away from the house as the sky turned brilliant shades of orange and pink. The desert air was finally cooling from the day's heat, and Grace pulled her shawl around her shoulders. "I've been thinking," Ethan said, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant, "about your situation." Grace's heart sank. Here it came. He was going to tell her she needed to find somewhere else to stay, move on, stop being a burden. "I know you're worried about your future," he continued, "about not having family or resources, and I wanted to make you a proposition." Grace stopped walking, steeling herself. Ethan took off his hat, running his hand through his hair in a nervous gesture. "I'm not good at this kind of thing. Never have been. But the truth is, Grace, I care about you, more than I've cared about anyone in a long time. These past weeks, getting to know you, seeing your strength and your spirit, it's made me realize something. I don't want you to leave, I want you to stay." "Stay." Grace's voice came out as barely a whisper. "With me. As my wife, if you'll have me." The words came out in a rush, and Ethan looked almost surprised he had said them. "I know it's fast. I know we haven't known each other long, but I promise you I would spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret it. You would never be a burden, Grace. You would be a partner, a companion, someone I could build a life with." Grace stared at him, torn between hope and fear. "Ethan, you don't have to do this. You don't have to marry me out of some sense of obligation." "Obligation?" He stepped closer, his eyes blazing with sincerity. "Grace, I'm asking you to marry me because I can't imagine my life without you in it. Because you make me laugh and think and feel things I haven't felt in years. Because when I found you on that trail, it felt like fate. Like I was supposed to be there at exactly that moment to find you." "I don't want you to regret this," Grace said, her voice shaking. "I don't want you to wake up one day and wish you had married someone with more to offer." Ethan set his hat on a nearby fence post and took both her hands in his. "Listen to me. You are not a burden. You are not worthless. The people who made you feel that way were wrong. You're brave and resilient and beautiful, and I would be the luckiest man in the territory if you said yes." Tears spilled down Grace's cheeks. For so long, she had felt unwanted, a problem to be solved or discarded. But the way Ethan looked at her, with such genuine warmth and affection, made something broken inside her begin to heal. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." The smile that broke across Ethan's face was brighter than the sunset behind him. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close, and Grace felt truly safe for the first time since her parents died. They were married 3 weeks later in Casa Grande, with Marcus and Vera standing up for them and half the town in attendance. Grace wore a simple but lovely dress that Vera had helped her make from fabric Ethan bought in town. She felt beautiful as she stood before the preacher, her hand in Ethan's, speaking vows that she meant with every fiber of her being. The reception was held at the ranch, with music and dancing and more food than Grace had seen in months. She was overwhelmed by the warmth of the community, these people who had accepted her so completely despite her arriving as a sick stranger. As the evening wore on, Ethan led her away from the celebration for a moment of quiet. They stood together under the stars, the music drifting on the night air. "Happy?" he asked, his arm around her waist. "More than I ever thought possible," Grace admitted. "A few months ago, I thought I was going to die alone in the desert. Now I'm married to the man who saved me, surrounded by friends with a whole future ahead. It feels like a dream." "Not a dream," Ethan said softly. "This is real, Grace. This is our life now." He kissed her then, sweet and tender, and Grace felt herself falling completely and irrevocably in love with her cowboy husband. They moved to Ethan's ranch the next day. It was smaller than the Double M, but Grace fell in love with it immediately. The house was a sturdy adobe structure with thick walls that kept it cool in summer and warm in winter. It had a main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen, and 2 bedrooms. The furniture was basic but well made, and Grace immediately saw ways to make it feel more like a home. The property itself was beautiful in the stark way of the desert. Mountains rose in the distance, and the land rolled in gentle hills dotted with mesquite and sage. The corrals held a dozen horses in various stages of training, and a small barn housed hay and equipment. Ethan had 2 ranch hands who lived in a small bunkhouse, Juan and his teenage son Miguel. They were respectful and hardworking and seemed genuinely happy that Ethan had married. "The boss, he is different now," Juan told Grace a few days after she arrived. "Happier. This is good." Grace threw herself into making the ranch a home. She cleaned and organized, sewed curtains for the windows, and planted an ambitious garden that she hoped would thrive despite the harsh climate. She learned the routines of the ranch, helping where she could, whether it was preparing meals for the hands or even assisting with gentler horses. Ethan was patient as she learned, never making her feel inadequate when she made mistakes. He taught her about horses with the same gentle persistence he showed the animals he trained. Grace discovered she had a natural affinity for the work, and several horses that had been skittish with others calmed under her touch. "You've got a gift," Ethan told her one afternoon as she worked with a young mare. "These horses trust you." "Maybe because I know what it's like to be scared and uncertain," Grace said, stroking the mare's neck. "I understand needing someone to be patient and kind." Ethan came over and wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "I love you, Grace Mercer. Have I told you that today?" She leaned back against him, warmth flooding through her. "You told me this morning, but I don't mind hearing it again." "I love you," he repeated, turning her in his arms to face him. "I love you today, and I'll love you tomorrow and every day after that." Grace reached up to cup his face, marveling at the tenderness in his eyes. "I love you too. So much it scares me sometimes." "Don't be scared," he murmured. "We're in this together, remember. I'll never leave you behind." Those words, the promise he had made when he first found her, had become something of a motto between them. Whenever things got difficult, whenever Grace felt overwhelmed or uncertain, Ethan would remind her of that promise. And she would gather her courage and keep going. Their first winter together was cold and challenging. The Arizona Territory might be known for its heat, but winter nights could be bitterly frigid. They spent long evenings by the fire, Ethan reading aloud while Grace sewed or knitted. They talked about everything and nothing, learning each other's thoughts and dreams. Grace discovered that Ethan had come west after his parents died, looking for a fresh start. He had worked as a ranch hand for several years before saving enough to buy his own land. Building the ranch from nothing had been hard, but he was proud of what he had accomplished. "I always thought I would do it alone," he admitted one night. "I never really let myself imagine having a wife, a family. It seemed like something other men got to have, not me." "Why not you?" Grace asked, setting down her sewing. He shrugged. "I don't know. I guess I was afraid. Afraid of losing someone I loved like I lost my parents. Afraid of not being enough." Grace moved to sit beside him, taking his hand. "I understand that fear, but we can't let it stop us from living. We have each other now, and that's worth being brave for." Ethan pulled her close, and they sat together in comfortable silence, the fire crackling and the wind howling outside. Grace had never felt more content. Spring brought new life to the ranch. The desert bloomed with unexpected color, and the horses thrived. Grace's garden began to produce vegetables, and she felt a deep satisfaction in contributing to their livelihood. She also started making connections with other women in the area, particularly Sarah Montgomery, whose family owned a large cattle operation to the north. Sarah was near Grace's age and welcomed the friendship eagerly. She and her husband Daniel came for dinner one evening, and the four of them had such a good time that it became a regular occurrence. Having friends, being part of a community, these were things Grace had not realized she was missing. In late spring, Grace began to suspect she might be pregnant. She waited a few weeks to be certain before telling Ethan, wanting to be sure. When she finally told him one evening after dinner, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. His eyes went wide with wonder. "A baby. We're going to have a baby." "In late December, I think," Grace said, unable to keep the smile off her face. Ethan let out a whoop of joy and swept her into his arms, spinning her around until she laughed and begged him to stop. He set her down gently, immediately looking concerned. "Are you all right? Should you be spinning?" "Is that safe?" "I'm fine," Grace assured him. "I'm going to have a baby, not break into pieces. but Ethan fussed over her anyway, and Grace found his concern endearing rather than annoying. He insisted she not overwork herself, took on more of the household tasks, and generally treated her like precious china. It was a stark contrast to her uncle's dismissive attitude during her mother's pregnancies, and it made Grace love her husband even more. Vera was delighted by the news and immediately set about making baby clothes and blankets. Sarah and the other women in the community rallied around Grace, offering advice and supplies. Grace felt embraced by a warmth of friendship and support she had never experienced before. As summer blazed across the territory and Grace's belly began to swell, she and Ethan would sit outside in the evenings, talking about their hopes for their child. "I hope they have your kindness," Ethan said one night, his hand resting on her growing stomach. "And your strength," Grace replied. "Your determination. I want them to always know they're loved," Ethan said seriously. "I want them to never doubt that they're wanted and valued." "They will," Grace promised. "We'll make sure of it." The pregnancy was not without its challenges. The summer heat was oppressive, and Grace struggled with it. She had some difficult days where she felt sick and exhausted. But Ethan was there through all of it, patient and supportive, never making her feel like a burden. By autumn, Grace was large and uncomfortable, counting down the days until December. She had prepared as much as she could, with a drawer full of tiny clothes and a cradle that Ethan had built himself. Sarah had agreed to come stay when the time came, as she had experience with childbirth and could help, but the baby had other plans. In early November, Grace's labor started suddenly and progressed quickly. Ethan rode for Sarah, but the baby was not waiting. With only Ethan and Vera, who arrived just in time to help her, Grace gave birth to a healthy baby boy on a cold November evening. Ethan held his son with shaking hands, tears streaming down his face. "He's perfect. Grace, he's absolutely perfect." Grace, exhausted but elated, watched her husband cradle their child. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names but never quite settled on one. Now, looking at the tiny life they had created, the name came to Ethan immediately. "William," he said, "after my father, William Thomas Mercer." "If that's all right with you." "It's perfect," Grace whispered. The inclusion of a middle name honoring her uncle, despite everything, touched her. It showed the kind of man Ethan was, willing to be generous even to those who had wronged them. Little William was a good baby, healthy and strong. Ethan was a devoted father from the start, walking the floor with his son at night, changing diapers without complaint, and staring at the baby with such wonder that it made Grace's heart swell. "I can't believe he's ours," Ethan said one night as they watched William sleep in his cradle. "That we made this perfect little person." "We did," Grace confirmed, leaning against her husband. "And we're going to raise him to be brave and kind and good, just like his father." "Just like both his parents," Ethan corrected, kissing the top of her head. The first years of William's life flew by in a blur of sleepless nights, first smiles, first steps, and first words. The ranch prospered, and Grace's confidence grew along with it. She was no longer the scared, sick woman who had been abandoned on the trail. She was a rancher's wife, a mother, a valued member of the community. She and Ethan fell into a rhythm of life that felt both comfortable and exciting. They worked together during the day, teaching William about horses and the land as he grew. In the evenings, they would sit together on the porch, watching the sunset and talking about their dreams. "I want more," Ethan said one evening when William was 3. "More of this, more of us. Do you think we could have another baby?" Grace smiled. "I think that could be arranged." Their daughter was born when William was 4, a tiny thing with Grace's dark hair and Ethan's brown eyes. They named her Emma Rose, and William was immediately smitten with his baby sister. "I protect her," he declared seriously, his small hand patting Emma's head with exaggerated gentleness. And he did. As they grew, William was his sister's fierce protector and partner in crime. The ranch rang with their laughter, and Grace often found herself pausing in her work just to watch them play, overwhelmed with gratitude for the life she had built. Not that everything was always easy. There were hard times too. A drought one year that tested their resources and resilience. A bad fall that left Ethan with a broken leg and forced Grace to take on more of the ranch work for months. Childhood illnesses that scared them both. But they faced everything together, their love and partnership seeing them through. On their 10th anniversary, Ethan took Grace back to the spot where he had found her. She had not been there since that day, and approaching the gnarled mesquite tree brought back a flood of memories. "I was so scared," Grace said quietly, looking at the place where she had lain dying. "I thought I would never see another sunrise. And now look at you," Ethan said, his arm around her waist. "Strong, healthy, surrounded by people who love you. You've built an entire life from that moment." "We built it," Grace corrected. "I wouldn't have any of this without you. You saved me, Ethan, not just my life that day, but me. You showed me I was worth saving." Ethan turned her to face him, his eyes intense. "You saved me too, you know. I was just going through the motions before I met you. Working, surviving, but not really living. You brought joy and purpose and love into my world. You gave me a family, a real home. Everything that matters to me started the day I found you here." They stood together in the desert, the wind blowing warm around them, and Grace thought about the journey that had brought her here. Being orphaned, being taken in grudgingly by her uncle, the wagon train west, the illness, the abandonment. It had all felt like tragedy at the time, like her life was falling apart, but maybe it had been leading her here all along. To this man, this life, this love. "I'll never leave you behind," Ethan said, echoing the promise he had made a decade ago. "Not ever." "I know," Grace replied, standing on her toes to kiss him. "And I'll never leave you either. We're in this together, remember?" As they rode back to the ranch, the sun setting in brilliant glory behind them, Grace felt nothing but peace. The scared girl who had been abandoned on the trail was gone, transformed into a confident woman who knew her worth. And it was all because a cowboy had stopped to help, had kept his promise, had chosen to love her. The years continued to roll by, marked by the growth of their children and the steady rhythm of ranch life. William grew into a capable young man with his father's skill with horses and his mother's compassionate heart. Emma was spirited and clever, with a love for the desert landscape that matched her parents' own. When William was 18 and Emma 14, Ethan and Grace were surprised to find themselves expecting again. Grace was 40 by then, and the pregnancy was harder than her previous ones. But their third child, a boy they named Jacob, was born healthy and strong, much to everyone's relief. A late blessing, Vera called him, and it was true. Jacob brought new energy to the ranch, and watching Ethan with their youngest child, still as patient and devoted as he had been with their first, made Grace fall in love with him all over again. William eventually married a girl from Casa Grande, a smart young woman named Catherine who fit into the family perfectly. They built a small house on the ranch property and started their own family, giving Ethan and Grace their first grandchildren. Emma, headstrong and independent, chose to become a teacher, moving to Tucson but visiting frequently. As Grace and Ethan grew older, they gradually handed more responsibility to William, though Ethan still worked with the horses almost daily. It was in his blood, he said, and he would never fully retire. On a warm spring evening when Ethan was 54 and Grace was 50, they sat on their porch watching their grandchildren play in the yard. Jacob, now 14, was teaching his nephew to rope a fence post, his patience a perfect blend of both his parents. "Did you ever imagine this?" Grace asked, her hand in Ethan's. "When you found me on that trail, did you ever think we would end up here?" Ethan considered the question. "I don't think I let myself imagine anything that day except getting you to safety. But I knew something had changed in me. I knew I had found something precious." "Someone precious," Grace corrected with a smile. "Someone very precious," Ethan agreed. "The love of my life." Grace leaned her head on his shoulder, comfortable in the way of long married couples. "You know, I used to wonder why. Why did you stop that day? There must have been signs that someone was there, but you could have ridden past. Why did you stop? Honestly, I don't know. Something made me look, made me notice the tracks leading off the trail. Maybe it was providence, maybe just luck, but I'm grateful every day that I did." He squeezed her hand. "Finding you was the best thing that ever happened to me. Even when I'm cranky and difficult," Grace teased. "Even then," Ethan confirmed with a laugh, "though I'd argue I'm the difficult one." "We're both difficult," Grace decided, "but we're difficult together, and that makes all the difference." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Grace reflected on the life they had built. From that desperate day on the desert floor to this moment of perfect contentment, it had been quite a journey. There had been hardship and heartache along the way, but there had been so much more joy and love than she ever could have dreamed. The ranch would continue beyond them, passed down to William and then to his children. The land they had nurtured, the horses they had raised, the community they had been part of, it would all carry on. But more than that, the love they had shared would echo through generations. Their children and grandchildren would carry forward the lessons they had learned, the values they had lived by. Years later, when Ethan was 62 and Grace was 58, they celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary with a gathering at the ranch. Friends and family came from all over the territory to celebrate with them. The house and yard were filled with people whose lives they had touched over the decades. Vera and Marcus were there, both silver-haired but still spry. Sarah and Daniel brought their own grandchildren. The community they had been part of for so long turned out in force, to honor the couple who had become such an integral part of the fabric of life in this corner of Arizona. As the party wound down and guests began to leave, William stood to make a toast. He raised his glass, looking at his parents with obvious affection. "To my mother and father," he said, "who taught me what love looks like, what commitment means, and how to face life's challenges with courage and grace. You've built something remarkable here, not just this ranch, but a family and a legacy that will last for generations. Thank you for everything." Grace felt tears prick her eyes as everyone raised their glasses. She looked at Ethan and found him watching her with that same tender expression he had worn on their wedding day. 40 years, she murmured. "Where did the time go?" "Right here," Ethan replied, gesturing to the people around them, the land stretching out beyond the house, the life they had created. "Every moment of it was right here with you." That night, after all the guests had gone and the house was quiet, Ethan and Grace sat together on their porch one more time. It had become their place, this porch, where they had shared countless conversations, where they had solved problems and made plans and simply enjoyed each other's company. "Do you have any regrets?" Ethan asked. "Anything you wish had been different?" Grace thought about it seriously. "I wish my parents could have met you. I wish they could have seen the life I built, known their grandchildren. But regrets? No. Even the hard parts led me here to you, to this life. I wouldn't change any of it. Not even being abandoned by your uncle, not even that," Grace said firmly. "Because if I hadn't been, you might have ridden right past me. We might never have met. and I can't imagine my life without you in it." Ethan brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "I love you, Grace Mercer. I loved you from almost the first moment I saw you, and I'll love you until my last breath. And beyond that, I hope," Grace said with a smile. "I plan to love you for eternity." "Deal," Ethan replied, and they sat together under the stars, two souls that had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and built something beautiful from that chance encounter. The years continued their relentless march. There were losses along the way. Vera and Marcus passed within months of each other, leaving a hole in the community. Several friends from those early days followed, but there were joys too. More grandchildren, the ranch continuing to thrive, the satisfaction of seeing their children and grandchildren living good lives. When Ethan was 68, he had a health scare that frightened them both. He collapsed while working with a difficult horse, and for several terrifying days, Grace sat by his bedside wondering if she was going to lose him. But Ethan rallied, his stubborn will to live as strong as ever. "Can't leave you yet," he told her when he was recovering. "I made a promise, remember? I'll never leave you behind." "I remember," Grace said, tears streaming down her face. "But one day we'll both have to leave this world. When that time comes, I want us to go together." Ethan recovered, though he finally agreed to slow down, letting William take full control of the ranch. He still spent time with the horses, but at a gentler pace. Grace, too, found herself slowing down, content to tend her garden, play with great-grandchildren, and enjoy the peace of their later years. They had been married for 50 years when Ethan fell ill again. This time, it was clear that he would not recover. The doctor was gentle but honest. Ethan's heart was simply worn out from a lifetime of hard work and living. Grace refused to leave his side. She sat with him day and night, holding his hand, reminiscing about their life together. Their children and grandchildren came to say goodbye, but in the quiet moments it was just the two of them as it had always been. "I'm scared," Ethan admitted one night, his voice weak. "Not of dying, but of leaving you." "I know," Grace whispered, her tears falling onto their joined hands. "But you kept your promise, Ethan. You never left me behind. You gave me 50 beautiful years, a family, a home, a life beyond anything I dreamed possible. That's more than most people ever get." "It wasn't enough," Ethan said. "I wanted forever with you." "You'll have it," Grace promised. "This isn't the end, it's just a pause. I'll follow you when my time comes and we'll have forever then." Ethan managed a weak smile. "I'll wait for you." "I know you will." He died peacefully 3 days later, Grace's hand in his, her voice the last thing he heard as she whispered her love one final time. The grief was crushing, a physical weight on Grace's chest that made it hard to breathe. After 50 years of partnership, of never being alone, the absence of Ethan felt like losing a piece of herself. But she was not alone, not really. Her children surrounded her with love and support. Her grandchildren and great-grandchildren reminded her daily of the legacy she and Ethan had created. And in the quiet moments, when she sat on the porch and watched the sunset, she could feel him there with her still. Grace lived for 3 more years after Ethan passed. They were quiet years, spent mostly at the ranch that held so many memories. She told stories to her great-grandchildren about the cowboy who had saved her life, about the love that had sustained them through decades of joy and hardship. She wanted them to understand that real love, lasting love, was worth fighting for. On a warm spring evening, much like the one when Ethan had proposed all those years ago, Grace sat on the porch watching the sunset. She felt tired but peaceful. Her time was coming, she could sense it, and she was ready. That night, she went to bed and simply did not wake up. The doctor said her heart had stopped, that she had gone peacefully in her sleep. But her family liked to think that Ethan had finally come to collect her, that he had waited as long as he could before taking her hand and leading her home. They buried Grace next to Ethan on a hill overlooking the ranch, under a gnarled mesquite tree that William had transplanted from the spot where his father had found his mother all those years ago. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. From that spot of abandonment and despair had grown a love story that spanned decades, that had created a family and a legacy that would endure. At Grace's funeral, William stood before the assembled crowd and told the story one more time. How his mother had been left to die, how his father had found her and made a promise he kept every day of his life. How from that chance encounter had bloomed a love that inspired everyone who knew them. "They taught us what it means to truly love someone," William said, his voice thick with emotion. "To choose them every day, to stand by them through everything, to build a life together one moment at a time. My father saved my mother's life that day on the desert trail, but she saved his too. They saved each other, and in doing so, they gave all of us an example of what love can be." As the sun set over the Arizona desert, casting long shadows across the land that Ethan and Grace had called home for over 50 years, their family gathered close. Children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren stood together, bound by the love story that had started it all. The ranch would continue, passed down through generations. The horses would still be raised and trained with patience and care. The land would be nurtured and respected. But more than any of that, the love that Ethan and Grace had shared would live on. It would echo in the way their descendants treated each other, in the values they held, in the understanding that true love means never leaving someone behind. On quiet evenings, when the wind blew across the desert and the sun painted the sky in brilliant colors, people said you could still feel their presence. The cowboy and the woman he saved, together at last, watching over the legacy they had built. A testament to the power of keeping promises, of choosing love, of believing that even from the darkest moments can come the brightest joys. And so their story ended, not in sadness but in celebration. Two lives intertwined, two souls joined, creating something beautiful that would last far beyond their years on earth. From abandonment on a desert trail to a love that spanned over half a century, Grace and Ethan Mercer had lived a life worth remembering, worth retelling, worth honoring. Their great-granddaughter, years later, would stand in that same spot on the hill and tell her own children about the ancestors who had started it all. About the promise made and kept, about the love that refused to give up, about the family that grew from one act of compassion on a scorching Arizona day. "Never leave anyone behind," she would tell them, echoing the words that had become the family motto. "Always stop to help, always choose love." That's what they taught us, and that's what we'll pass on to you. And the story would continue, generation after generation, a living memorial to two people who had proven that love could triumph over abandonment, that kindness could change the course of a life, and that promises made from the heart were the most sacred kind of all. The ranch stood strong, the family thrived, and the love story of Grace and Ethan Mercer became the foundation upon which all future happiness was built, a shining example of what it meant to truly love someone with your whole heart, through every trial, for all of your days.